You're listening to Tapasya Loading, a boutique podcast for the holistic creative. And I'm going to be doing a solo cast for you folks today. This episode is brought to you by the Holistic Musician Academy and safeandsound.studio. Mentoring for serious creatives looking for deep support. For musicians and artists, I have a free course for you. 6 days, 1 map, real change. Please go to holisticmusicianacademy.com and click on free training. For vocation agnostic coaching and facilitation inquiries, please go to safeandsound.studio. I'm TL Mazumdar, pianist, songwriter, educator. Let's stoke the fire. The problem with holistic. Hi there, folks. It is 15 past 2 in the morning, and I'm breaking a lot of my own rules at the moment, juggling multiple deadlines as the album recording comes to a finish. And I've been wondering what I'd like to share this week on the solo cast. And being that it is that a lot of my artistic practice is coming together in ways through multiple routes, more on that later, I thought, being that it is that I am the founder of an academy called the Holistic Musician Academy, that I work on a piece called The Trouble with Holistic. That's the title of today's solo cast and the article I wrote with it from the solo cast and so on and so forth. This might come as news to some people, but I actually struggled with the word holistic for reasons I'm going to get into right now. And naming my first coaching academy aimed at musicians, the Holistic Musician Academy, was not the easiest of decisions. And I'd like to offer an explanation why. This was a word I spent years distrusting, which eventually I found out ended up being very telltale of the life that I've led. But before I get too vague about it, let's just start with a little origin story of my relationship with the word. The first time I actually noticed the word holistic the first time I noticed the word registering in my brain, let's just say, was during a conversation with one of my ex-girlfriends, who was an incredibly accomplished artist in her own right, while I was trying to understand why the conservatory I was working at the time kept pressing me to take on more teaching hours. Now, this was a phase of my life where I was far more interested in performing and touring, and I was doing a lot more of that as well. I think a part of me was worried about being judged or being labeled the failed musician who teaches. That's a thing. It's a cliche. And in hindsight, all of that feels very ironic, given that we now live in an age where more and more artists hustle to advocate exactly what I was in those coaching and instrumental lessons at the conservatory, which is not just a mastery of a vocation, but also a deeper understanding of what it is, what it means to be practicing an art as a human. The entire gamut of experiences, that encompasses. She said something on the lines of, and this is the reason why it registered or stuck to me, because it was actually kind of a compliment, except I hadn't realized it at the time. I think it's the holistic perspective you bring. We need a lot more of that. I'm roughly paraphrasing what she said to me. Why I distrusted it, that word, not what she said, was deeply connected to parts of my childhood. I grew up with somewhat skeptical connotations attached to that word, holistic. 12 years as a kid in India, without a passport for a lot of that time, whole different story. While I observed a steady stream of one-way traffic from all parts of the world, kind of like the eat, pray, love tourist type, throwing it all around at pseudo spiritual retreats, quite blissfully oblivious to the ground realities they often stood on. And for the longest time, the word, it kind of reminded me of privilege soaked in essential oils at some premium Ayurvedic wellness resort or something, which most locals probably couldn't afford and from which they were often, quite literally, gated away. Holistic seemed to belong to a rather specific brand of performative, expensive wellness, masquerading as some elevated wisdom with cultures they actually came from, a lot of the essence came from, reduced to treatments and complicated social realities flattened into something soothing enough to be sold back to the world as a very viable product. Yeah, stress on soothing. It took me up until about, 5-6 years ago, I think, well, roughly the time I actually decided to found the Holistic Musician Academy, to not only make peace with this part of my vocabulary, that word, holistic, but to also set out to reclaim what turned out to be the story of my own life, staring me in the face the entire time. Now, the story behind the word. My personal anecdote here is, I might have mentioned this in some of the earlier episodes or interviews I've done. I grew up speaking a mix of 6 languages, 2 which I've forgotten since, convinced as a toddler back then that they were all one. It was a constant shape-shifting involved in growing up across 4 countries, 3 continents, while my parents, not province, I don't know where that word came from, not the word we're talking about tonight, not a word that exists either for that matter. Anyway, 4 countries while my parents traveled relentlessly until each version of me kind of began to form a self-sufficient little universe of its own as the witness of it all from within itself, the self, the witness of all these events. I don't know, does that sound too philosophical for you? I guess I'm kind of pulling from my non-duality lens here. My apologies if that gets too weird. Well, okay, I might as well just give you a quick primer. Non-duality is basically a kind of philosophical school where the whole idea is about observing the observed. So if you can observe yourself moving, navigating through the world, the question to ask here is, who is observing who? Who are you observing and who is observing it? Get it? I don't know, maybe it's outside the scope of what I'm talking about here, but long story short, at some point I did come to notice that pattern between all of these personas that ended up building and how there was a space from which I could observe each one of them. But that observer was the one which started feeling increasingly uncomfortable with all of these personas who kind of formed self-sufficient universes and on some days felt like had nothing to do with each other. So at some point that observer, that self-observing all of these personas, felt like it was threatening to morph into the eternal chameleon itself. That's when it got a little, not just uncomfortable, but scary. Then there was my unconventional route in music itself. I grew up on a wild combination of bootleg tapes, vinyl, amidst the strains of whatever else could find its way into the air of a Middle Eastern country in the 80s, which was later declared a dictatorship by the West and shut off from much of the world where access to music itself was quite uncommon. I remember later on my bated breath waiting for Top of the Pops on telly. Living in London, telly is what we call television TV for non-Brits out there. Followed later on by my first lessons on an organ because we couldn't find a piano teacher. Learning Christian music from a nun in a South Indian village. Moving on to training in South Asian classical music while in schools, post-primary schools in India, high school basically. I have no idea where that stands in non-Indian school vocabulary, but you know what comes after primary school, because I did primary school while in the UK. And high school in India was me studying a lot of South Asian classical music because we had South Asian classical music in one of the schools I went to. And one of the teachers got me studying university level stuff there too. I've lost a lot of it, but I did have a pretty thorough training at some level from a certain lens, at least for the time anyway. Then I was playing in cover bands, playing rock music in an Indian metropolis, that was Calcutta. I also went on to become a founding member of India's first official Afro-Cuban ensemble. Following which, I moved back to Europe, completing a diploma in jazz piano performance and arrangement, and eventually moving into songwriting, production, as a singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who produces his own music with a whole bunch of other artistic modalities thrown into it, like psychology and critical thinking and all of that. So all of this probably sounds like one massive, messy flex, but the reality behind all of this was that I was waking up for decades with identities that felt almost, well, violently incompatible on some days. I mean, just even like on a musical level, I was writing my songs, I was arranging them, I was performing most of the instruments, I was then producing them, mixing, mastering. And this was at a time where a lot of these procedures were a lot more complex than they are today. To this day, depending on which phase of my life someone's met me, in their perspective, who I am can sound as though they're describing completely different people, different lifetimes even, from culture to nationality, language, to gender, sexual orientation, to relationship with the body mind. I can think of no one single question I didn't look under those rocks to examine. And for years, I read that multiplicity as evidence that I'd somehow failed to settle on one single coherent identity beneath all the languages, the countries, disciplines, cultural codes, and apparently contradictory versions of me, trying to pinpoint the notoriously elusive, authentic self was a work in progress. I've only recently started feeling the kind of agency I could hope for over the years. The proposition that the relationship between those parts might itself be the identity took much longer to occur to me. This year has been an important one. It felt like a homecoming. Well, this past year, a homecoming kind of disguised as a discovery, it feels like. That sounds very poetic and almost ambiguous. But I've been studying a lot of new material in psychology, which has a specific modality called parts work, which again is best known from this modality called internal family systems. Some of you might have heard of it. It bases itself on the idea that the psyche, or the being, the human mind, is not a single unified voice, but a system of parts, each carrying its own history, its own fear, its own protective job, held together by a core self that can stay steady without being hijacked by any of them. Quite a concept, actually. Consider rewinding for a bit and listening back to that, or read the blog post. It's all out there in writing. What struck me during these studies was not how new it felt, but how familiar. Well, old anyway. Not necessarily familiar, I take that back, but how old. It's like, I knew this. It felt unfamiliar and yet resonant. And the farther I went, the more I traced it back, ironically, to the very ancestral traditions, that had been kind of handed down to me in a dozen different ways without my ever noticing them as a system. The multiplicity of self already mapped in the yogic scriptures, the tantric currents of Buddhism and Hinduism that never once pretended the mind was one quote-unquote clean thing. The Indic Vedas, Tibetan texts I've studied at some point. Yeah, I have been a nerd, in case you hadn't noticed, on all levels. Lineages that have been describing the internal family for centuries before anyone in the West gave it an acronym, or at least mainstream media or mainstream psychology gave it a name or a training certificate. The framework I thought I was learning turned out to be, hence, a homecoming of sorts. I realized that the chameleon I had spent years treating as a defect is less evidence of my missing self and more the very system my inheritance had already charted for me the whole time. I'm not sure that came out right, but seems to be the best way I can put it at the moment. I guess the biggest realization was that the correlations between all of these parts was the closest thing to an identity I'd actually ever felt. It's been about 5 years now that the Holistic Musician Academy exists. But I've also had my artist moniker every now and here, a moniker dedicated to the time-space paradigm. It's a tribute to that every now and here, which can also be read as every nowhere, hence time-space. Then there's Tapasya Loading, my podcast, which is all about stoking the sacred fire, another metaphor. And now, more recently, Safe and Sound Studio for vocation, agnostic coaching for creatives from all parts of life. And all of these, in different ways, I realize now have been doing the same work. On paper, they could look like completely different things. An artist profile, a coaching platform, a podcast, and now a space opening all of that work up to people beyond the arts or music. In practice, though, they've all grown out of the same preoccupation with what happens when parts of a life that have been told they don't belong to each other are finally allowed in the same room. Because most of us, regardless of our upbringing, are trained to separate them early. One of the ways I've noticed how musicians end up manifesting that in their practice is separating technique from expression, creativity from livelihood, ambition from mental health, the body from the mind, the artist from the teacher, and both from the person trying to pay rent, maintain relationships, navigate an industry, and somehow retain a reason for making the work in the first place. Specialization has its place, of course. Having your profile, your niche, and so on and so forth. Hey, I'm glad my dentist concentrates on my teeth rather than seeing them as an energetic metaphor for my relationship with abundance, yeah? But somewhere along the way, the ability to isolate every problem for the purpose of just examining, analyzing, or even pathologizing it became confused with the idea that the problem actually exists in isolation. I fall back upon my personal trainer training in some ways, and I'm always telling my movement clients or physical training clients about how compound exercises are the best way to actually build balanced muscular structures. Isolating some exercise and overdoing your bicep curls or something like that has historically never really ended up in long-term longevity or health. And the way that transfers to every other aspect in our lives, arts, creativity, or profession, personal life, whatever, is very, very, very similar. A musician or an artist or a creator's nervous system doesn't disappear when they enter a rehearsal room or a studio or go on stage. Our relationship with money doesn't wait outside politely while we negotiate a fee. Childhood adaptations don't cease operating because the subject of a conversation happens to be something like marketing. Also, structural realities that involve even more uncomfortable themes like class, gender, race, nationality, or disability, accessibility. These are incredibly complex terms in this day and age, and can't always be coached away by improving someone's quote-unquote mindset. Or just that, isolating all of that to mindset. Although I will contend that the more I explore this theme, none of them can be addressed without addressing mindset either. I'll give it that. Yeah, I will admit. That is, as contradictory as that sounds, listen back to that and, listen back to that. Not all of it is mindset, but none of it is really anything without mindset. But still, not every difficulty is categorizable in that. Not every difficulty is to be categorized as some difficulty that can be led to trauma either. And I'm kind of putting myself out on the ledge when I say this. But I do feel that there's, trauma is another word that's starting to qualify as one that's being overused by the underqualified, just like something like narcissism or boundaries. I'm not saying trauma doesn't exist. I, for all, by the way, have lived experience in some of its darkest iterations, by the way. But what I exactly want to avoid, what I almost fell for right now, is making an identity out of that. A trauma is not identity. Or attempting to make one out of that is a very, very slippery slope. So, not everything is about trauma either, or the nervous system, or a limiting belief. Sometimes we just need a better skill set. As a musician, you need to put in a little more practice hours, a more realistic plan, stronger technique, clearer communications. God, let's not even talk about communications. I'm in the thick of negotiating some of the most complex and, well, for lack of a better term, biggest contracts of my life. And trust me, my respect for communication skills and its relevance in that entire context has gone up to a whole new level, even after almost 30 years of doing this full time. So it's not just about one isolated factor. Sometimes it's about getting a proper contract. Sometimes it's about having a competent doctor or the right physiotherapist, or even just an evening off, or the courage to admit that something that had been working for a long time and something that we'd been working on for months just is not the right fit anymore. Does that make sense? Taking the whole person seriously also means resisting the temptation to force every problem through whichever lens happens to be the easiest for us to use. And in some cases, also, to be honest, fashionable, marketable, or personally familiar. Again, those are slippery slopes to slide down. Okay, what I do and don't mean by the word holistic in this at this point here. This is where much of what calls itself holistic still loses me. The themes I just described a couple of minutes back. Here's the thing. Combining several vaguely adjacent practices doesn't automatically make the result holistic, especially when the cultural histories of these practices have been stripped away and repackaged for people whose only reason to access these in the first place is because they have sufficient resources to consume them. That's a tad harsh, I know, but it's also a reality. Spiritual language being sprayed over a business model as well is also something that remains indifferent to the material conditions of the people it often claims to serve. So when I use the word now, I am not looking at spiritual connotations at all. Holistic to me is just a deeper description of wholesomeness. I'm trying to get at taking enough of reality, extrinsic and intrinsic, into account for the work to have a chance at being honest, sincere. That is what holistic is starting to mean to me personally. Now, this doesn't necessarily require dragging every aspect of someone's life into every conversation. That's very individual and nuanced and contextual. But what it does mean for me personally is acknowledging that the aspect we are working with belongs to a larger living system, and that changing one part of that system will affect several others, one way or the other. Because somewhere they're all connected. Sometimes it's clear to see, and at other times it's a little more complicated. Messy even. It also means acknowledging the limits of my own role. A holistic perspective doesn't make me a therapist, even though I actually am a certified psychotherapist, but not licensed. I did a whole episode on the scope of practice last week, I think, or a couple of weeks back. It certainly doesn't make me a financial advisor or a doctor or a physiotherapist manager or some spiritual authority. If anything, I mean, hopefully that was clear enough, but just to be clear, and just a reminder, these are very specific qualifications. If anything, what it does do is make it more important to recognize when someone needs one of those people rather than me pretending to have some magic toolbox with an answer for everything. And that's changed the way I understand teaching as well. Because for years, I'd unconsciously accepted some hierarchy behind the phrase failed musician who teaches, as though performing represented the vocation in its purest form, and teaching was plan B. That's not true, by the way. I think I might have mentioned in other traditions, in fact more traditions than we know of, the majority of musical traditions historically have always thought of teaching as the highest form of practice for the art. If you look at martial arts, I always find that a much easier example to cite about how the higher the grade, the more they teach, and the higher the grade, the less they compete at some point, because there's only so much space left for competition in the practice of an art beyond a certain span of time, and so on and so forth. And I can confirm that the reality in my own life has been very much almost the opposite of this teaching being plan B, because teaching made me listen differently. which deepened my relationship with music. Coaching changed the questions I brought. Podcasting, for example, what I'm doing right now, forced me to articulate. It's ironic that I've mispronounced the word articulate, but podcasting forced me to articulate connections that had previously existed as instinct. Writing, which to be fair, I've been doing almost as long as I've been playing music, something I hadn't realized for up until recently, by the way, helped me recognize patterns that performing wouldn't always name or couldn't always name. I think back to the time where one of my composition teachers kept insisting that I spend more time writing my compositions out on paper without an instrument and see how it affects my practice. And it really did. I did a whole year of arrangement and composition classes where I got homework to write stuff out, music that I was not allowed to write at my instrument. And sometimes I'd go do that at cafes and just use paper and pen to do it. And all of these, they've not just deepened my practice, it's also really kind of like made it get a whole different league of real. Yeah. There's a reason, though, that the music I grew up inside has been sliced so thinly into sellable parts. And I took a conversation with a mentor of mine a few years back to see it more properly, And this is why the industry has taught me to distrust, or had taught me to distrust, the whole in some ways. Now, this might seem a little tangential at the moment, but hear me out. But like this mentor, and I'm not going to quote names because I don't have his permission to share it, although I don't think he'd actually mind, and he's quite well known in his circles, quite the figure. This is a guy who's managed rock stars. 9 out of 10 people listening to this podcast right now would recognize, yeah. But I don't want to name drop. And at the time, he was helping me out with a demo of mine of an album. He was actually helping me pitch to some major labels, all of whom kept refusing me. It was a very different time. And long story short, I was a brown German guy with a South Asian name writing songs in English. And I just didn't fit any boxes that they happened to be buying that quarter or for some time now. Some of the themes he brought to my attention, though, on a tangent during our conversations, were an eye-opener of a different sort. Things like how entire economies of nations have historically relied on their music industry in ways the public eye doesn't necessarily realize. It's not like it's secret, but people just don't see it. Music, for example, has been an instrument of soft power, of export, national identity, for as long as there have been nations to project it and consumers to create demand for the same. Once you see that, once you identify the pattern, which is actually pretty obvious once you do catch a whiff of it, all the gatekeeping looks way less about taste and so much more about control of what is essentially a pretty valuable commodity. An industry that has had that much at stake has every incentive to narrow what an artist is allowed to be. And this is where we reconnect again with the concept of holistic. So in that industrial paradigm, the artist is kind of guided is not the right word, but kind of pushed into specific genres with a specific marketability, a specific face even in some cases. Basically a unit of output that can be signed, shaped, even maybe replaced, and most importantly sold for profit. A product that hits prescribed numbers, strategies. And that is the context the Holistic Musician Academy was founded to counterbalance. In its humble, but I'd contend very powerful way. The way I saw it or see it, if an industry has spent decades trimming the artist down to the parts that sold well, then the work worth doing was the reverse. To hand creators the whole of their practice back, or help them anyway. I'm not handing anyone anything. Better still, remind them that it was never taken away from them. The body, the mind, the history, the craft, the inner life, the lineage, the art. We have more, so much more agency over it than we realize. Not art as output, but the artist as a whole human being who happens to make art, which is what every tradition understood thousands of years before the existence of an industry. And this matters more than ever in this day and age because we're living through the age of AI slop now. It's started endless generated content, frictionless and hollow, arriving faster than anyone can listen. And in the middle of it, board members of trusted institutions like the Grammys even, or respected musicians people look up to, keep repeating inaccurate accounts about the entire process, being a sign of just more technological progress. For the first time, and I've always been very tech-friendly, technologically friendly, for the first time I'm going to say, no, that's not what this is. That is simply not accurate. And now the legal systems and some of the first courts who've started to look at it closely have started acknowledging it. If you go to the Post, there's more information on that, exact lawsuits being won against AI music companies and so on and so forth. Well, anyway, this is precisely why a holistic perspective on our artistic practice is no longer a luxury. If our entire worth as an artist is just input to the machine built to generate output, will always look like a replacement. If our practice is whole, rooted in history though, in the body, in a lineage, purpose, and a reason for making the thing that has always nothing to do with feeding a feed. I'm not sure always fit in there. Sorry, I messed that one up, but hopefully you got it. In a reason for not always making things that has something to do with a feed, then that machine, the new machine, the whole AI machine, the boogeyman, is not competing with us at all. And artists who get that will be just fine. The ones who reduce themselves to content long before the machines arrived are the ones most exposed. They're gonna get, well, fucked over a little quicker than some of the rest of us. Did I speak French again? Oh, I held out for a while tonight. Anyway, for those of you who are listening and find some of this to be resonating, I want to leave you with actionable steps, is what the kids say, I think. Just a few pointers that might help you kind of take this forward and implement them in a way that actually helped. Because otherwise I'm just spouting philosophy, which in itself is not unimportant. But here are a few steps I would say connected to what I just went on about, which could go a long way in helping you, my fellow artists and creatives, or even those who appreciate an artistic lens on life. 1, get your art together. Nothing else counts before that part is sorted. Yeah, there's no shortcut here. No amount of philosophizing is going to be a substitute for actually being good at your art. Not your brand, not your marketing, not your PR, your art. Know what you're actually doing. Make sure you pay your dues, like the jazz musicians say. And more importantly, not just what, more importantly, why. And at a depth no prompt can even attempt to reach. Listen to that again. Two, read history. Folks, read some history. The industrialized, monetized version of music is a very recent and very narrow slice of what music has ever been. The oldest instruments we have found were, I don't know, bird bone and mammoths. Ivory, literally like ivory made out of mammoth teeth or something. Flutes from the caves of the Swabian region in Germany, which are apparently around 40,000 years old, made by people who had barely secured food and shelter and still chose to carve something to make music with. So, point being, art was never a luxury. It wasn't something that arrived once survival was handled. If anything, it was part of how our species survived at all. That is the older and truer job description, and it's still available to you. 3. Build the ecosystem. The future is not the lone genius against the algorithm or the machine. It's community, collaboration, mentorship offered and received, a culture of elders meeting younger, newer practitioners at eye level with mutual respect in a cycle that keeps renewing itself. The teacher and the student are the same person at different points on the same road, which is the thing that whole conservatory conversation I'd referred to earlier on with my ex-girlfriend was pointing to all along. My conclusion. I have lots of containers at this point, for example, like Every Now Here's, explores my questions through my music, my records, performance. The Academy, Holistic Musician Academy, applies them to the lives and careers of fellow artists and creatives trying to build something sustainable. Tapasya Loading, this podcast, lets me examine all of these through conversations, research. And now Safe and Sound Studio extends that same inquiry beyond musicians and artists, because it became increasingly obvious that much of what I had learned through working with art was never really exclusive to artists alone. Now, these contexts might look like they change, but the essence underneath is all the same. There might be, the name Safe and Sound, for example, my vocation agnostic coaching modality, carries a lot of the message I'm trying to get across at this point, which is about safety. Safety to me doesn't mean constructing a permanently comfortable environment in which nothing difficult can be said, attempted, or risked. And anyone who's put in some serious work in any avenue of their life knows that creativity is messy. It's confronting. It's brutal on occasion. But there's a difference between the adversities and challenges involved in growth, involved in that whole growth, and the destabilization caused by a complete absence of trust as a result. Trust in others, trust in our world, trust in our art, and most importantly, trust in ourselves. Safety is not a destination, it's a foundation we need to internalize on our own terms so we don't forget to do what we actually came to the planet to do, which is celebrate life. The bigger picture at the end of this all, wow, it's been quite a long session, huh? I used to think fragmentation was my private problem to solve. I don't think that's the case anymore. Truth is, we've never been disconnected and more divided at any time in history, maybe. But the ground that art was always meant to hold was to bring us together, not as decoration or content or a wellness accessory. It's actually one of the oldest technologies we have for making something fractured whole again. And that's not a romantic claim. It's turning out to be a measurable one. Numerous organizations, including the WHO, have reviewed this. And there have been actually more than 3,000 studies, I think, if I'm not mistaken, You can have a look at the article again, which concluded that engagement with the arts plays a significant role in preventing illness, promoting health, and managing and treating conditions across the entire span of a human life. What every surviving tradition already knew was this: art is medicine. It's ritual, memory, cohesion, the place where the body, mind, and, if your belief system permits, soul meet, where grief and history and the sacred were always allowed back into the same room. And the evidence now is catching up. The function had never expired. It's just become a little more urgent. In an age that can generate infinite hollow illusions of art, the real thing, made by a whole human, a holistic artist, for reasons a machine will never have, becomes not less valuable, but on the contrary, irreplaceable, indispensable. So, that winding, bewildering road that I've been through, and I bet some of you listening have been through as well, artist or not, was never a failure. And it was never meant to be one clean thing. It was school. It was training. Training for a moment that needs people who can hold multiplicity without breaking. The word available for that, however compromised, is holistic. And I suspect that I intend, not to say that my intentions are suspicious, okay, shut up, Theo. I intend to keep using it until it means what it always was supposed to mean. Hope that helped. Thanks for hearing me out. If you're still listening, remember, we're an independent show. If you want to show our support, the best way you can do so is spread the word. Like literally, that's my most preferred methodology. Spread the word. Tell your friends that we exist. Let them know that they can tune in anytime. This is a complimentary community service I offer to all my listeners. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider doing stuff like, I don't know, giving us reviews on Apple Podcasts or sharing us on your social media stories and so on and so forth. And you're always welcome to visit me on the Holistic Musician Academy or safeandsound.studio or everynowhearmusic.com. Have a fantastic week. I'll see you around.
Hey folks, I hope you found that episode helpful. Here's a little request. If you did, consider sharing this episode with your folks. Think about the ways in which they might benefit the way you did. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have queries. My name's TL. I'm an independent musician and educator and the founder of the Holistic Musician Academy.